So we've talked a lot about formed elements. Now it's time for us to talk a little bit about the plasma and the stuff that is dissolved in the plasma. So we'll start there. So blood plasma, it's the clear yellowish liquid part of the blood, and we describe it as one of the extracellular fluids. And I think back in the first class I introduced that term and told you that I would use this abbreviation ECF for extracellular fluids. The ECF is, the blood plasma is about 92% water. The remaining 8% is a mix of dissolved organic and inorganic biochemicals, but by far and away the most abundant of those biochemicals are the proteins that are dissolved in the blood. And there are multiple functions to blood plasma. This is one place, this is an important place where we transport nutrients. A lot of gas is transported, dissolved in the plasma, so it's not just attached to hemoglobin, but oxygen and carbon dioxide are both transported as dissolved gases in the plasma. The vitamins, hormones, waste, they're all dissolved in blood plasma as well. And it's blood plasma that actually moves back and forth across the walls of the capillaries, providing regulation of fluid and electrolyte balances. Remember, electrolytes are the salts, sodium, chloride, potassium. All of those are the electrolytes, the ions. And it's also responsible for assisting in maintaining pH of body fluids too. So lots and lots of roles involved with blood plasma. We're going to talk next about the plasma proteins. Plasma proteins, as we've said already, are dissolved in the plasma, and they remain in the blood plasma and in other extracellular fluids that they get into as well, and are never digested as a nutrient source. So the point of these plasma proteins is that they serve their function, their protein function, rather than being a nutrient source to the body that gets digested. And there are three main groupings of the different blood proteins. There are the albumins, the globulins, and a kind of protein called fibrinogen. So albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen. And we're going to look in the next 3 slides at each one of these groupings. And we'll start with the globulins. I'm sorry, the albumins. What am I saying? Oh, goodness. Yep, it's getting a little crazy in here is all I can say. So albumins are about 60% of all of the dissolved plasma proteins. So they are clearly the most abundant of the dissolved plasma proteins. And they are produced by the liver. So it's the job of the liver. It's one of the jobs of the liver is to make these plasma proteins, the albumins. And their primary job is to provide, well, one of their jobs is to provide colloid osmotic pressure to blood plasma. So when we talk about osmotic pressure, and so I'm drawing here a blood vessel with all of these albumins dissolved in it. So when we talk about osmotic pressure, it's always the call or the pull that it creates to draw water toward whatever the fluid is. And so if you recall, if we have, say, blood here and it's 92% water and the rest of it is composed of these, primarily of these albumins, and there's out in the tissues we have, say, 94% water because there's not quite as much protein dissolved in the tissue fluids. So here's the tissue, the cells out there in the tissues, and which direction then is water going to flow? So we got 94% water outside of the blood vessel, 92% water inside the blood vessel. And if you want to, pause your video for a minute and puzzle this out. We'll just go ahead and write in 8% protein, give or take. And we'll just assume that the rest of this out here is protein, so 6% protein. So which way will water go? And it's only the water that can flow. The gaps between the cells of these capillaries here, the blood vessels, those gaps are too large to let these large albumin proteins get away. So which way does the water flow? Okay, so hopefully you've thought about that some, and now you're back with me to give an answer, and let's see if you agree with me. The water will move into the blood from the tissues by osmosis. So when we talk about osmotic pressure increases as more and more protein is found in a fluid. And it's the greater abundance of protein that reduces the percentage of water. So because water is at a relatively low value, osmosis is going to move water from a region of high water content, to a region of low water content. So that's why water will flow into the blood, because of the colloid osmotic pressure of the blood. So these albumins are trapped in there, they cause fluids to be drawn into the blood, and that helps to ensure that blood volume and therefore blood pressure are both maintained the way they need to be. Because if you lose fluid from the blood, then you're going to lose volume, and along the way you're also going to lose blood pressure. Albumins also have another job, and that is to serve as the transport proteins for the materials that do not dissolve in blood. So if we need to carry bits of lipid, for instance, which doesn't dissolve in water, well, we can carry it because these dissolved albumins can attract and bind to the lipid, and then because the albumin is dissolved, away it goes, carrying the lipid, the digested lipid. Some hormones are also built out of cholesterol, another lipid, so they don't dissolve in water. That bilirubin that we've already talked about, and many drugs all require transport proteins. So lots of things, and this is just a very short list of the kind of things that require transport proteins in order to be carried in the blood. And so albumins have that responsibility too. Okay, so that's the albumins. Let's go look at the globulins then. Globulins are, as we've said, are also proteins, and they make up something on the order of almost 40% of the plasma proteins found in the body or in the blood. So between the albumins and the globulins, we get almost 96% then of the proteins dissolved in blood. And there are different kinds of globulins, and by the way, they get that term or the name globulin because they're globular proteins. A protein is a long string of amino acids. Remember the other night I suggested to you that a protein is like a spaghetti strand. Here's the spaghetti strand would be this long string of amino acids all held together by peptide bonds. But proteins are never found in this long string shape. They instead ball up on themselves in a very characteristic way depending on the sequence of those amino acids here. And so they ball up into a glob, hence the name globulins. And there's a whole classification system for globulins. The alpha globulins and the beta globulins are both produced at the liver, and they are also transport proteins. Gamma globulins, and you may have heard that term because that is a term for any antibodies that are introduced into the blood. They are introduced as a gamma globulin shot, and they can help you to fight a disease or some sort of condition. So gamma globulins are the same as antibodies. That's just another term for them. And they're produced by the cells of the lymphatic system, specifically the B cells, or actually the offspring of B cells. And gamma globulins are involved in immunity. And so these are the antibodies floating in the bloodstream that we have talked about already. So lots of different kind of globulins, several different sources. And then last of all, the third kind of protein is fibrinogen. And this is just a small part of the plasma proteins. And fibrinogen is also produced by the liver. But it is the protein molecule that, when triggered, will go from being dissolved protein to being fibrous strands of protein that will then create a meshwork that traps red blood cells and traps platelets, creating a clot. And if you turn to page, here it is, page 541, there's a great picture of an electron micrograph where they have captured this image of all of the fibrin threads or strands. So fibrinogen is converted to fibrin. Fibrin is not dissolved. It is fibrous, and it creates a meshwork that traps red blood cells and platelets, forming a clot. So that's all involved in blood coagulation. We'll be talking about that in the next video. Okay, so three kinds of proteins in the blood: the albumins, the globulins, and fibrinogen. So that's not the only thing that's carried around in blood, though. Gases and nutrients make their way in the blood. So we transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. There's a lot of nitrogen also dissolved. In fact, it's the most by percentage. It's the highest dissolved gas, most abundant dissolved gas in blood. But it doesn't have a physiological function. That's just a characteristic of the air that we breathe. It's like 70% nitrogen. So yeah, we've got a lot of nitrogen dissolved in our blood. And then nutrients. So as we digest foods, then we break down proteins into amino acids. We break down carbohydrates into simple sugars built of either one or two saccharide, one saccharide alone, or two saccharides that are bound together. And then lipids, finally. So as we digest simple sugar or sugars and lipids, then they enter the bloodstream and can be carried around to their destinations where they're going to be used. So amino acids are generally taken in at the liver and are used to build the proteins that we see in the blood, or sent out to the muscle cells and other protein-requiring cells to help stimulate repair and growth processes. But we can also turn those amino acids into an energy source, so that's possible too. We'll talk a lot more about that as we encounter the chapter on the digestive system. These simple sugars include glucose. Glucose is transported off to cells and used as an energy source to make ATP, or it can be taken to the liver to be converted to and then stored as glycogen. So remember, glycogen is the storage form of glucose. And then finally lipids, because they don't dissolve in blood, they require transport proteins to carry them around. And we can talk about those transport proteins as lipoprotein complexes. So a complex molecule built of lipids and proteins together. The proteins are dissolved, and they can then transport the lipids, which don't dissolve through the blood. All right, last of all, there are the almost last of all, sorry. Didn't mean to tease you. Two more slides left. There's the non-protein sources of nitrogen, or not sources, but materials of nitrogen. So we carry a lot of waste non-protein nitrogen materials, including all these nitrogenous wastes. We've already mentioned amino acids, so we'll move right on to nitrogenous wastes. These are the toxic end products of metabolizing amino acids and nucleic acids, and they include urea, uric acid, and creatine. So all three of these are, we don't want them in high volumes in the blood. So that's the job of the kidneys, is to filter them away. But so nitrogenous wastes. And anytime we notice an increase in blood urea nitrogen, so that's looking at urea content of the blood as a way of tracking the nitrogen in the blood, also referred to as BUN or BUN, it can indicate that there's something going on in the kidneys, that, some sort of disorder of the kidneys. It could be that it's telling us that we're seeing excessive metabolism of protein, or it can be a side effect of infection. So tracking blood urea nitrogen can tell you a lot about the functioning of the body. Okay, last of all, also found dissolved in the plasma are all the plasma electrolytes. So electrolytes are ions. That means that they have a positive, those are particles with a positive or negative charge. So they've either gained an electron, which would make them, you might want to stop the video and puzzle it out. If you gain an electron, what will the charge be? All right, so I'm going to assume that you figured it out. It would be negative. Whereas if you lose an electron, then the charge for the molecule becomes, or the atom becomes positive. So ions are absorbed by the intestine from digested food, and they can also be a byproduct of metabolic reactions. So we produce a lot of ions throughout the body. And so some of the ions include sodium, that's what Na is, chloride, that's what Cl is, potassium, that's what K plus is, HCO3 is the bicarbonate ion. I should have said HCO3 minus, so it has a negative charge. Calcium has 2 positive charges, so it's lost 2 electrons, or gained 2 protons. Phosphate, PO43 minus. Sulfate, SO4 2 minus. So I'm not going to ask you, don't bother to memorize these names for bicarbonate and phosphate and sulfate. I don't need you to memorize their formulas. I just want to give you a sense of it all. The most abundant of the plasma electrolytes are sodium and chloride. And bicarbonate ion is really important because it maintains osmotic pressure of blood. It's big enough that it can't leave the blood. And it also can regulate pH. And so when we get to talking about acid-base balancing, we'll have a lot to say about chemical reactions between the I lost my train. Dadgummit. Yes, there we are. As we talk about acid-base balancing, we'll talk also about some of the chemical reactions that occur with carbon dioxide dissolved in water to form first carbonic acid and then the bicarbonate ion. And so it is implicated strongly in maintaining pH of the blood. But that can wait until almost the very end of the semester, so we're not going to dive into there yet. Okay, so that's everything I've got to say about the blood plasma and the contents of blood plasma. Just to review, we talked about the plasma proteins, albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen. We talked about gases and nutrients dissolved in blood plasma. We talked about non-protein nitrogenous substances like urea, uric acid, and creatine. And we talked about plasma electrolytes. So lots of stuff. All right, in the next video, we'll be talking about hemostasis, how we prevent the loss of blood. So there'll be lots of fun waiting for you there. Again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to send me an email.